"You've made a mistake, Derek," I thought as he laughed beside his new fence. 6 feet of stolen earth doesn't sound like much until you've stolen it from me. My name is Nolan Price. 48 years old. Ecologist. 23 years spent holding developers accountable. I've seen entire projects collapse over less. Derek believed money and lawyers would shield him. He had no idea he had just crossed a line the state of Washington would bury him for. What I was looking at made my stomach turn, but not for the reasons Derek thought. The fence post gleamed silver in the morning sun, cutting a clean line through what used to be the natural buffer zone between our properties. Derek had moved fast. The whole thing went up over the weekend while I was visiting my daughter in Seattle. Clean work, professional installation, expensive. "I'll handle it properly," I told him, keeping my voice level. He adjusted his designer sunglasses and grinned wider. "Handle it properly. What's that supposed to mean?" His voice carried that tone rich men get when they believe they are untouchable. "I have the best lawyers in Bellevue. This fence isn't going anywhere." I looked past Derek at his mansion's $7 million of marble, glass, and arrogance, sitting on what used to be the Hendricks family farm. The old house had been torn down 2 years ago when Derek bought the property from Mrs. Hendricks after her husband died. She needed the money for medical bills. Derek needed a trophy estate to match his startup success. "Well, see," I said. Behind Derek, I could see his wife, Vanessa, watching from their kitchen window. She waved, probably thinking this was just neighborly small talk. Their twin boys, maybe 8 years old, were kicking a soccer ball on their pristine lawn. Normal family stuff, if you ignored the fact that their father had just stolen 6 feet of my land. "Look, Nolan, I know you're upset about this, but it's just property lines. Nobody really knows exactly where they are anyway." Derek kicked at one of my survey stakes that he had pulled up to make room for his fence. "Besides, what are you going to do with that strip of weeds?" "I'm actually improving the neighborhood." That strip of weeds he was talking about was a natural wetland buffer. It had been there for decades, maybe longer. The original survey from when I bought my place 15 years ago clearly marked it as part of my property. But more importantly, it was part of a protected habitat area that extended down to the creek running behind both our houses. Something cold settled in my chest as I watched Derek walk back toward his mansion. He had no idea what he had just done. No idea at all. I bought my place in Spokane 15 years ago, right after my divorce. 3 acres of mixed woodland and wetland. Nothing fancy, but it backed up to a protected creek habitat that connected to the Spokane River system. The house was a simple 2-story built in the 1980s, wood siding that needed paint and a deck that sagged on one corner. Perfect for a man who wanted space and quiet. My work kept me traveling around the Pacific Northwest, consulting on environmental impact assessments for everything from shopping centers to housing developments. I had seen what happened when developers cut corners when they thought regulations were suggestions instead of laws. The fines, the legal battles, the projects that got shut down mid-construction. Most people had no idea how serious the state was about wetland protection. Derek had moved in 2 years ago with big plans and even bigger money. His startup, some kind of logistics software for manufacturers, had gone public and made him wealthy overnight. The first thing he did was tear down the old farmhouse and build his monument to success. $7 million for a house with 6 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, and a 3-car garage that cost more than most people's entire homes. He had introduced himself the day after moving in, bringing over a bottle of expensive wine and talking about how we were going to be great neighbors. He asked me what I did for work. Seemed impressed when I mentioned environmental consulting. "Must be interesting," he had said. "All that technical stuff." The warning signs had been there for months. Small things at first. His landscaping crew had started dumping yard waste near the property line instead of hauling it away. Their sprinkler system was spraying onto my side of the boundary. I mentioned it to Derek a couple of times, and he always said he would look into it, but nothing ever changed. Then came the bigger issues. His contractor had parked equipment on my land during the construction of his outdoor kitchen. When I asked them to move it, they told me Derek said it was fine. I had to walk over and explain the property lines myself. Derek apologized, said there must have been some confusion, but I saw the look in his eyes. He was testing me. The fence was just the latest move, but it was different. This was permanent. This was him taking what was not his and daring me to stop him. What Derek did not understand was that in environmental work, you learn to be patient. You document everything. You know that the worst violations often look like small problems at first until someone with the right knowledge takes a closer look. I had been watching his property for 2 years, noting things that bothered me professionally but were not my business to report until now. That afternoon, I walked the fence line with my old survey maps, measuring distances and taking photos. The fence ran exactly 6 feet into my property for about 200 yards, from the road down to where the land sloped toward the creek. Derek had been careful. The installation was professional. The posts were straight. And the surveyor stakes that marked my boundary had been pulled up and tossed aside. But standing there with my measuring tape, something else caught my attention. The fence did not just cross into my property, it cut into the wetland buffer zone. That was a completely different kind of problem. I pulled out my phone and opened the environmental database I used for work. According to state records, the creek behind our properties was classified as critical salmon habitat. The wetland buffer zone extended 30 feet from the high water mark on both sides. Derek's fence now cut directly through protected habitat that had been undisturbed for decades. That evening, I sat on my deck with a beer and really looked at Derek's property for the first time in months. The mansion itself was beautiful, no question about that. But from my angle, I could see how close he had built to the creek. Too close, maybe. The outdoor kitchen and pool area seemed to be right at the edge of what should have been the setback zone. I went inside and pulled out the environmental impact reports I had collected when construction first began. As a professional courtesy, I had requested copies from the county just to see how they were handling the wetland issues. The permits showed setbacks, buffers, and restrictions that were supposed to protect the habitat. But looking at Derek's finished project, I was not sure those restrictions had been followed. I made some coffee and spread the original environmental survey across my kitchen table. The protected area was clearly marked, along with the required 30-foot buffer. According to the permits, nothing permanent could be built within that zone. The fence was bad enough, but if the house itself was in violation, that was something else entirely. I sat back in my chair and really thought about what I was seeing. Derek had spent $7 million on a property that might have been built illegally. The fence was just the piece that made it my problem. I thought about Mrs. Hendricks, how she had cried when she signed the papers to sell her family's farm, how Derek had promised to respect the land's natural beauty during the neighborhood association meeting where he had presented his building plans. How he had looked me in the eye earlier that day and laughed about taking my property. I finished my coffee and reached for my phone. It was time to make a call to someone who would be very interested in what I had just discovered. The next morning, I walked over to Derek's house around 9 a.m. He answered the door in workout clothes, probably heading to his home gym. "Nolan, what brings you by so early?" "That fence," I said. "I need you to move it back to the actual property line." His smile faded. "I told you yesterday, that fence isn't moving. I had it surveyed. It's exactly where it should be." "You had it surveyed by who?" "My contractor's guy. Professional surveyor, licensed and everything." He crossed his arms. "Look, I understand you're upset, but..." "I'm not upset," I cut him off. "I'm telling you the fence is on my property, and it needs to move." Derek's face changed. The friendly neighbor mask slipped off completely. "You know what your problem is, Nolan? You're stuck in the past. This whole area is changing. Property values are going up. I'm improving things around here, and you're worried about 6 feet of weeds. Those weeds are protected wetland habitat." He laughed. "Wetland? It's a drainage ditch with some grass around it. Don't try to scare me with environmental nonsense. It's not nonsense. Your fence crosses into a 30-foot buffer zone that's been protected since the creek was designated critical salmon habitat. That's a state violation." For the first time, Derek looked uncertain, but it only lasted a second. "You're bluffing," he said. "I have all the permits. Everything was approved by the county. If there were environmental issues, they would have told me." "Maybe they did," I said, "and you ignored them." His eyes narrowed. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm explaining the situation." "No, you're trying to intimidate me because you're jealous of what I've built here." "Well, guess what? I didn't get where I am by backing down from bitter old men who can't handle progress." I started to respond, but Derek held up his hand. "Hey Race, what's going to happen?" he said. "You're going to accept that the fence stays where it is, or I'm going to make your life very difficult. I've got lawyers, I've got money, and I've got connections. You want to fight me over 6 feet of mud? Bring it on." That afternoon, Derek made good on his threat. A certified letter arrived from his attorney claiming that I was harassing his client and threatening frivolous litigation. The letter demanded that I cease all contact regarding the fence and warned of legal action if I continued to interfere with what they called lawful improvements to the property. But that was not the worst part. By evening, I had received calls from 3 neighbors asking what was going on. Derek had been calling around the neighborhood, telling people I was trying to cause problems over some imaginary property dispute. He painted me as the difficult neighbor, the crank who could not accept that the area was improving. Dorothy, from 2 houses down, even stopped by around dinner time. "Nolan, honey, I heard you and Derek are having some kind of disagreement. He moved his fence onto my property." "Well, I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding. He seems like such a nice man. His wife brought me cookies when my husband was in the hospital last month." "Dorothy, he took 6 feet of my land without asking. But it's just a little piece, right? Maybe you could work something out. I'd hate to see neighbors fighting." After she left, I realized what Derek was doing. He was isolating me, making it seem like I was the unreasonable one in a neighborhood where most people barely knew their property lines and just wanted to get along. I was becoming the guy causing drama over something they could not see or understand. Around 8 p.m., my phone rang. Unknown number. "Is this Nolan Price?" "Yes. This is Detective Williams with Spokane Police. I understand you've been having some kind of dispute with your neighbor." My stomach dropped. "What kind of dispute?" "Mr. Langford called this afternoon. Says you've been threatening him and his family. He wanted us to be aware in case things escalate." After I hung up with the police, I sat in my kitchen feeling like I had been sucker punched. Derek had played this perfectly. He had stolen my land, isolated me from the neighbors, and now had the police thinking I was some kind of threat, all in less than 24 hours. But he had made one mistake. He had pushed me hard enough that I was not thinking about being neighborly anymore. I opened my laptop and logged into the state environmental database. As a licensed consultant, I had access to detailed records most people never saw. I pulled up every document related to Derek's property development, every permit application, every environmental review. What I found made me sit back and whistle low. The original environmental impact assessment had flagged multiple concerns. The proposed building site was within 50 feet of the creek, which required special mitigation measures. The report specifically mentioned that any permanent structures needed to maintain the 30-foot buffer zone from the high water mark. Most importantly, the final approval was conditional on a post-construction environmental compliance review that was supposed to happen within 6 months of completion. The house had been finished 14 months ago. No compliance review had ever been conducted. I kept digging. The original site plan showed the house positioned to maintain all required setbacks, but the satellite imagery from last year showed something different. The actual building footprint was at least 20 feet closer to the creek than the approved plans indicated. I pulled up the wetland delineation report that had been required for the permits. The protected area was clearly marked with GPS coordinates and detailed boundary descriptions. According to the survey, the wetland buffer started exactly where Derek's new fence now stood. His fence was not just crossing into my property. It was marking the beginning of protected habitat that his mansion had been built right through. I called Tony Reeves, an old friend who worked for the State Department of Environmental Quality. "Tony, it's Nolan. I need to ask you something off the record." "What's up?" "Hypothetically, if someone built a house in violation of wetland setback requirements, and there was never a post-construction compliance review, what would happen if DEQ found out?" "Hypothetically? They'd be in deep trouble. We take wetland violations seriously, especially in critical habitat areas. Could be looking at restoration orders, heavy fines, even criminal charges if it was willful." "What kind of restoration orders?" "Depends on the severity. Worst case scenario, they'd have to remove whatever structures were built in the protected zone and restore the habitat to its original condition." "Even if it was a house?" "Even if it was a house. We've ordered demolitions before. Not often, but when someone blatantly ignores environmental law, we don't mess around." After I hung up, I sat staring at my laptop screen. Derek's $7 million mansion might be sitting in the middle of a protected wetland. The fence was just the tip of the iceberg. The next morning, I called the Department of Environmental Quality Enforcement hotline at 8 a.m. sharp. Professional to professional. "DEQ Enforcement, this is Janet. This is Nolan Price, licensed ecologist. I need to report a potential wetland violation in critical salmon habitat. Can you hold for a compliance supervisor?" A minute later, "This is Director Walsh. What do you have?" "A residential structure that appears to have been built in violation of wetland setback requirements, plus a new fence that cuts directly across the protected buffer zone." "Location?" I gave him the address and my consultant license number. "I can provide GPS coordinates, satellite imagery, and copies of the original permits that show the violations." "Send everything to my email." "Well, have someone out there within 48 hours. I spent the morning preparing a comprehensive report: satellite photos showing the house position versus the approved site plan, survey maps with the wetland boundaries clearly marked, photos of the fence cutting through the buffer zone, the original environmental impact assessment with all its unmet conditions. But I also included something else: the enforcement history for similar violations, cases where DEQ had ordered partial or complete demolition of structures built in protected areas. The legal precedents showed they did not make exceptions for expensive houses or wealthy owners. That evening, Derek came to my door. Different approach this time: friendly smile, bottle of wine in his hand. "Nolan, I think we got off on the wrong foot yesterday. I know you're upset about the fence, and I want to work something out." "What kind of something?" "I'll pay you for the 6 feet. Fair market value, plus a little extra for the inconvenience. We can get it appraised, make it official. The fence needs to move." His smile tightened. "The fence is staying where it is, but I'm willing to compensate you fairly for the land use. It's not about money." "Everything's about money, Nolan." "How much?" 10,000? 20? I looked at him standing on my porch with his expensive wine and his condescending smile, offering to buy his way out of stealing my property. He had no idea what was coming. "There's no amount," I said. "There's always an amount. Good night, Derek." I closed the door and watched through the window as he stood there for a moment, probably trying to figure out what had just happened. He had tried threats, then isolation, now bribery. None of it had worked, and he could not understand why. The DEQ inspectors arrived at 9 a.m. on Thursday in a white pickup truck with state government plates. Two people, Director Walsh and a younger woman with surveying equipment. I watched from my kitchen window as they parked in front of Derek's mansion. Derek answered the door in his business casual outfit, probably thinking they were there about some routine permit issue. I saw him gesture toward his property, confident and relaxed. Then Walsh showed him something on a clipboard, and Derek's whole posture changed. The inspection took 4 hours. They walked the entire property with GPS units, took photos of the house's position relative to the creek, and spent a long time examining the fence line where it crossed into the wetland buffer. I stayed inside, but I could see them pointing at specific areas and making notes. Around 1 p.m., they came to my door. "Mr. Price," Walsh said. "Thank you for the report. We need to verify some of the boundary information with you." I walked them around my property, showing them the original survey stakes and explaining how the fence had been moved. The younger inspector, introduced as Sarah Martinez from the Compliance Division, took GPS readings at multiple points along the fence line. "This fence is definitely in the protected buffer zone," she said to Walsh. "And based on our measurements, the house itself is at least 15 feet closer to the creek than the approved site plan shows." Walsh nodded grimly. "We'll have the full report completed by tomorrow, but this looks like a clear violation of state environmental law." That afternoon, a certified letter was delivered to Derek's house. I watched him sign for it, open it on his front steps, and then sit down heavily on the porch stairs. He stayed there for almost an hour, just staring at the letter. Around 5 p.m., Derek came to my door again. This time, he looked different, pale, shaken. "Nolan, I need to ask you something." "What's that?" "Did you call the state about my house?" I met his eyes. "I reported a fence that was built illegally into protected wetland habitat. They're saying I have to tear down the house." His voice cracked. "The whole house, Nolan. They're saying the entire structure is in violation of environmental law and has to be demolished. $7 million. I wouldn't know anything about that." The demolition order came down 6 weeks later. DEQ's final report concluded that Derek's mansion had been built in willful violation of wetland setback requirements, that the required post-construction compliance review had been deliberately avoided, and that the fence represented continued encroachment into protected habitat. The state gave him 90 days to restore the property to its natural condition, complete demolition of all structures within the protected zone, removal of all non-native landscaping, and replanting with native vegetation approved by the Environmental Compliance Division. Derek hired 3 different law firms to fight the order. He appealed to the county, to the State Environmental Board, and finally to federal court. Every appeal was denied. The law was clear. The violations were documented. The satellite imagery proved everything had been built contrary to the approved plans. The demolition began on a Tuesday morning in March. I watched from my deck as the excavators rolled up Derek's driveway. The fence came down first. 20 minutes of work to remove what had started this whole mess. Then they began dismantling the $7 million house, piece by piece. Derek and his family had moved out the week before. I heard they were renting a place in Lake Oswego while he tried to sell his startup to cover the restoration costs and environmental fines. The total bill was approaching $8 million more than the house had cost to build. The neighbors stopped calling me the difficult one after the news report started running. "Local startup executive faces multi-million-dollar fines for environmental violations" was the headline in the Oregon Tribune. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know about wetland protection and buffer zones. Mrs. Hendricks called me the day after the demolition finished. "I heard what happened to that awful man," she said. "I always worried he didn't respect the land the way my husband did." 6 months later, my property was quiet again. The land where Derek's mansion had stood was now planted with native grasses and young oak trees. The creek ran clear, and I had started seeing salmon in the shallow areas again. Sometimes I walked down to where the fence used to stand and remembered Derek's laugh, his certainty that money and lawyers could solve any problem. He had learned the hard way that some laws exist for reasons bigger than property values or personal convenience. The environmental fines and legal costs had forced him into bankruptcy. His startup was sold off to cover debts, and last I heard, he was working for someone else again, back to being an employee instead of an empire builder. Standing in the restored wetland buffer, watching the water flow toward the Spokane River, I reflected on how one phone call had changed everything. Not because I was angry or vengeful, but because I knew protecting the environment meant following the law even when it cost $7 million to tear down the evidence of breaking it. So, tell me, what would you have done if you were in my shoes? Would you have let Derek keep his fence, let it go for the sake of peace? Or would you have made the same call I did, knowing it might cost him everything?